So right here, I'm inside my for loop, meaning this part of the code repeats for every expense the user enters. The program already asks how many expenses the user wants to type in, and now it is going to expense by expense. Each time the user enters a value, and it saves it in a variable called expense. The line on now total equals total plus expense is basically adding the new expense to the running total. So if the total was 20 and the user enters 10, the new total becomes 30. This is how the program keeps track of everything the user has spent without needing to write separate variables for each expense. After that, I use an if statement to figure out the highest and lowest expense. For the first expense, I set it as both the highest and the lowest because there's nothing else to compare it to yet. Then, after this one, every new expense gets compared. If the new expense is bigger than the current highest, then it becomes the new highest. And if it's smaller than the current lowest, then it becomes the new lowest. This part was probably one of the parts I had to think about the most because I needed the program to compare the numbers correctly while the loop was still running. So it connects to like what we learn about if and else statements because the program's making decisions based on conditions. After the loop finishes, the program calculates the average by dividing the total by the number of expenses entered. So the formula is total divided by the number of expenses. This gives the user a better idea of how much they usually spend per expense, not just the total amount. Then I call my function called the show results. I made this function so the final output will be organized and not all like crowded inside the main function. So the function takes in the total, average, highest, lowest, and the number of expenses. Then prints everything in a clean summary. This also what we learn about functions and where function is a block of of a code that performs just like a specific task. At the top of the function, I use fixed and set precision 2 because money usually has two decimal places. So instead of printing something messy, it prints the value like 25 50, like 25.50 or 100 point zero zero. That makes the output look like more like real money. And at the end of the program, I ask the user if they want to run it again. This is why I used a do while loop around the main part of the program. A do while loop runs the program at least one time first, and then it checks if the user wants to repeat. If the user types y or lowercase y, the program starts again, and if they type anything else, the program ends and prints a thank you message. Overall, my program is simple, but it uses a lot of the main things we learned in class. I use variables to store values, send and count for input and output, loops to repeat actions of statement, to check conditions, arithmetic to calculate the total and average, and the function to like organize the final results. I chose this project because I wanted to make an expense tracker because it is simple enough to build with a C++ concept that we've learned. So there's also something useful in real life. Like a lot of people spend money during the day and not really notice how much it adds up. So this program gives the user like a quick way to see how they're spending their money. For example, if someone enters expenses like food, coffee, transportation, or school supplies, the program can show how much they spend in total and what their average spending amount was. It can also show what their biggest expense was and what their smallest expense was. Biggest and smallest, yeah. So the that makes the program more useful than just adding numbers. One thing I tried to focus on was keeping the code understandable. I did not want to make the project more complicated than what we learned in class, so I used basic C++ concepts from the PowerPoints like double variables, for loops, while loops, if and else statements, and one user defined functions. The while loops are used for error checking. For example, the number of expenses cannot be zero or negative because that will not make sense. Um, Also, an expense should not be negative because the user is supposed to enter an amount they spent. So, if the user types a negative number, the program asks again. This makes the program more reliable. The for loop is useful because the number of repetition is known after user enters how many expenses they want to include. So if they type 4, the loops runs 4 times. So that if they type 10, it runs 10 times. This is better than writing the same input code over and over again. So it's not repetitive. The if statement for the highest and lowest are important because the program has to compare values. The first value is used as a starting point, and then every other value is checked against it. This part shows how the program can make decisions while it's running. The function show results makes the code cleaner instead of printing the final summary in the middle of the main program. So I moved it to its own section. That way, the main function is mostly focused on getting input and doing calculations, and the show results function is focused on displaying the output. Now I will run the program and show how it works. The program first welcomes the user and asks how many expenses they want to enter. I will enter a few example expenses and I enter each amount. The program adds it to the total and keeps checking for the highest and lowest value. When I finish entering the expenses, the program prints the expense summary, and the summary includes the number of expense they enter, the total amount spent, the average expense, the highest expense, and the lowest expense. Then the program asks if I want to run it again. If I type Y, it repeats. If I type N, the program ends. So, in conclusion, this project helped me practice main C++ topics we learned in class in a way that actually has a purpose, and it is not super complicated program, but it works, it is organized, and it solves a real small problem by helping the user track spending.